Monsters aren't real, at least, that's what I used to believe. But some things don't hide in the dark. Some things smile at you, love you, and sleep right beside you until the moment you realize you never really knew them at all.
Growing up, I always feared monsters. Even in college, which most would consider to be the time when you can be called an adult, my greatest fears were the monsters under my bed, in the closet, or at the window. I would always tell myself how silly this was, seeing as I was an adult at this point and I was still afraid of something I knew did not exist. That was until I met my wife. But before I tell you what happened, let me elaborate on how I met my wife to be and how much she means to me.
Wait, what are you doing right now? You are not subscribed yet. This story is gonna get freaky, so hit the like button and subscribe, or you're gonna find me under your bed tonight.
I met Natalie in college. I was a nerdy guy, yet she saw in me something that no other girl in my life had. She was an extremely kind person, who always had the sweetest of intentions. As I spent more time with her, I realized how many things we had in common. To me, she was the most beautiful girl in the world. I could stare into her green eyes for the rest of my life. And that's what I chose to do when I proposed and we finally got married. Fast forward to married life. I am working now, while she is working on an online master's degree. Life is good. Life is actually perfect. Too perfect. Ever since we got married, I've told her everything. My deepest secrets, my deepest feelings, and most importantly, my deepest fears. I remember when I first told her about my silly fear of monsters. At first she laughed it off, but over time, she noticed how I would sometimes shiver in bed, lying awake in fear. Being the sweetheart that she is, she would hold me and tell me it would be alright. My wife became my protector. She became the one to keep my fears in check. Her face became that of an angel to me, one that would protect me from whatever scary things life had in store for me. I came to trust those beautiful green eyes, and every time I saw her, I knew I was safe. Now to the more weird things that have been happening of late. The first incident that I can recall that could be defined as strange happened at 3 a.m. one night. I woke up feeling extremely thirsty, and being the fearful guy that I am, grabbed the flashlight to go get some water. As soon as I turned on the flashlight, I noticed my wife wasn't in bed. I looked over to the bathroom and the light was on and I could hear the water running, so I assumed she was there. Half asleep, I walked downstairs to the kitchen and almost had a heart attack when I saw my wife standing in a corner drinking water. As soon as I saw her though, I felt safe. She smiled at me as she sipped the water from the glass. I was too tired and I mumbled something about how hot it is as I got some water. She continued to smile at me as I finished my water and headed upstairs. As I walked back upstairs, I called out that she should come back to bed, seeing as it's so late. When I get back to my room, there she was, sound asleep. This was the moment I became wide awake. I could have sworn she was downstairs having water. Afraid to go back downstairs, I woke her up and told her what happened. Half asleep, half upset, she comforted me and told me to go back to bed. The next morning she joked about how I'm so afraid of the dark that I see her everywhere as my protector. Besides, I was using the bathroom when you thought I was out of bed, she claimed. With that warm smile, how could I think otherwise? A week later, another strange incident. This was in broad daylight, while on a Saturday morning, Natalie woke me up at 11 a.m. and told me she was going to get groceries. At around 11:30 a.m. I finally got out of bed and dressed up for a late brunch with my beautiful wife. I went to the kitchen and found her drinking a glass of water. I smiled and said, "Back so soon, honey?" She didn't reply, just smiled as she sipped on her water. Before I could approach her, the doorbell rang and I immediately went to go see who it was. I opened the door. Yes, it was my wife, back with all the groceries. "Oh, help me with all of this, will you?" she jokingly snapped as she put down the paper bags by the door. As soon as she saw my color-drained face, she knew something was wrong. She sat me down, got me some water, and I told her what happened. This time it was in broad daylight, and I knew what I saw. As much as I had come to adore her beautiful green eyes, for the first time, I saw in them a strange fear. My wife was the strong one, never afraid. She told me there is something she should have told me a long time ago. She said this happened to her as a kid, a lot, where her parents and siblings would see her in places they knew she wasn't. They could never explain these occurrences, but seeing as it caused no harm, they came to live with it without really questioning these encounters. It took me a few months to process everything she had told me, but I started to live with it also. Like I said, my true perception of fear was monsters, not my beautiful wife. Several similar incidents happened. For instance, I would see her sitting in bed, only to find her cooking in the kitchen downstairs. And in all these instances, when I would interact with this entity that I still saw as my wife, she would smile and not say anything. I actually came to find comfort in seeing my wife all the time, always smiling, always happy, and always perfect. It is important to note, however, that in all of these incidents, there was never any overlap, meaning I never saw her in two places simultaneously. I guess any sane person would have called out to their wife when they thought they were seeing the entity. But like I said, I found comfort in her green eyes, in her smiling face, so honestly I didn't really care. Then today, everything changed. My wife told me she was going to visit her grandparents who live an hour away from where we do. She invited me to go, but seeing as it was a Sunday and I just wanted to be lazy, I told her to go ahead without me. This is when it finally happened. The overlap. I was in my living room watching TV when I got up to get myself a Coke. There she was, my wife again, sipping water from a glass and just smiling. I was so used to it by now, knowing this was the entity. I smiled and said, "And it is nice to see you are still watching over me." She smiled and continued to look at me with those beautiful green eyes I had grown so fond of. That's when the phone rang and I turned away from the entity to pick it up. "Hey sweetie, I'm going to run a little late since Granny insists on me staying for lunch." It was my wife, and as soon as I heard her voice, I heard a glass shatter, which my wife on the phone also heard. I turned around and saw that the entity was now glaring at me, the smile no longer there, but rather a very disturbing grin. She was pointing at me, with her head tilted at a perfect 90-degree angle. But that wasn't what disturbed me, it was her eyes. They were no longer the green that I found so much comfort in. They were pitch black, like those demons in the movies. I stared at her as I was at a complete loss of words. "Honey, is everything okay? Did you drop something?" my wife asked on the phone. I whispered back into the phone, "I didn't." She did. At this point my wife screamed into the phone, "Hang up and look away." I don't know how I found the strength to do so, but I did exactly what she said. When I opened my eyes a split second later, she was gone. Confused and scared, I called my wife back, who said she was already on the way. It shouldn't have happened. It shouldn't have overlapped. They said it wouldn't. They said she was harmless. I am too scared to just sit around and wait. I still keep looking over my shoulder. My wife should be home any time now. As soon as she gets back, I will ask her who she meant by they and what the is going on. She knows something and I have to know what it is. Never did I think that the one I hold so near and dear to my heart, the one who protects me, could become the monster that I fear the most. When my wife, Natalie, finally got back, she came in crying and wouldn't stop. She kept saying, You don't deserve this. We don't deserve this. You weren't supposed to overlap. I love you. I care about you. You're family. You shouldn't have overlapped." At this point I was really confused. I comforted her, held her until she stopped crying. Then when she finally settled, I asked, "Love, you're not making any sense. Who is she? Are you referring to the entity?" She told me she doesn't have a name for it and she has never actually seen her. Only others around her can sometimes see her, but she has always been described as someone who looks just like her, the same radiant smile and the same lovely green eyes. "But when you screamed in the phone earlier, you knew that what I was seeing, didn't you?" "How?" She looked at me and started crying again. "I only kept it from you because I didn't want to freak you out," she said. "It's all right, just tell me everything," I replied, pulling her close. Then she told me the story of the last person who overlapped, meaning saw her and the entity at the same time. When Natalie was in high school, her family, namely her parents and 2 brothers, were used to seeing it, as I call it, for the lack of a better word, around the house. She was always described as a smiling girl, who would usually just be sipping on water. This occurrence only seemed to happen in her house, never at school or outside. Her parents, knowing the situation, would never allow her to bring any friends over for fear that they might freak out what they see. But one day, upon her insistence, and arguing that seeing it has never done anyone harm, her parents let her bring over a friend. Natalie and her friend Chris were working on some homework when Natalie decided to go down to the kitchen and grab some snacks. While she was coming back up, she heard Chris saying, "Very funny, but you're weirding me out with that smile." Natalie stopped dead in her tracks, but it was too late. The door to her room was open, and she was in direct line of sight of Chris in the hallway. He turned to look at her, his face completely pale, as Natalie heard glass shattering. She was completely in shock. Chris was looking at them simultaneously, staring wide-eyed in the corner of the room. She heard him say, "What in the—" Natalie ran towards her room, but the door suddenly slammed shut. She started banging on the door. "Chris, don't look at her. Just don't," she screamed across the door. But silence. The door opened 5 minutes later and she found him unconscious. After taking him to the hospital, they found out that Chris went blind. Doctors could not explain it. And when they asked Chris to describe the last thing he saw, he struggled for words. That grin, those eyes, black eyes, and her head. Oh God, her head was tilted 90 degrees. I never thought such a beautiful face could be so twisted. She thinks the only reason I can still see is because the overlap happened over the phone, so I wasn't able to feel the full effect, whatever that means. I was surprised that another overlap like this hadn't occurred throughout her life. That's when Natalie told me that they said she was harmless and will not actively try to overlap. So then I inquired about the they that she just mentioned. Well, when I was a kid, my great-grandparents knew something about this. They were very hush-hush about it, but apparently it had happened in the family once before. So it was clear then we needed to go see her great-grandmother, who was the only one left that could provide us with any answers. Natalie called her mom and was told that they hadn't been in contact with their great-grandmother for the past 2 years. Ever since her husband died, she became depressed and asked not to be contacted and broke off all ties. She lived out in the country by herself, secluded from the rest of the world. It was going to be a 3-hour drive, so we decided to attempt to get some rest before our drive the next day. We barely got a few hours of sleep in. My wife woke me up this morning, telling me breakfast's ready as she walked downstairs. I noticed both of us must have missed our alarms since it was 11 a.m. already. The first thing I checked when I woke up was the bed, to make sure I wasn't seeing it. When I finally went downstairs, I nearly fell backwards when I saw my wife, sipping from a glass of orange juice, facing the kitchen entrance. "Jeez, don't do that," I snapped. She came rushing towards me. "Sorry," she mumbled. I walked over and gave her a hug. "It's all right. We are both on edge. We'll work through this." After a breakfast that neither of us had the appetite for, we hit the road to find some answers. As we were driving, my wife held my hand, and I felt safe once again. It was a strange sense of security, because even after the crazy events, it was bright and sunny outside, and I was peacefully driving away with my wife. She smiled at me. I smiled back, looking at her beautiful green eyes, while fighting internally to take the image of the twisted entity off my mind. We remained quiet for most of our journey until we finally reached the house. The house was located deep off of a small highway on a narrow dirt road. There was an old van parked, but it didn't look like it had been driven for weeks. The house also looked like it had been abandoned for a while. My wife reached out and I held her hand. "Let's hope for the best and see what we find," I said. But before I could open the door, my cell phone rang. The moment the first ringing sound broke the quiet air, my wife clutched my hand just a bit tighter. She was on edge, I could tell. I looked over at her and she was smiling ever so slightly. I pulled out my phone and looked at the caller ID. It read Natalie. The grip of the hand that I was holding started getting tighter and tighter. I suddenly got the feeling I was not with my wife at all. Call it a gut feeling. I picked up the phone as I realized the person in my peripheral vision was changing their expression. The breathing also got heavier as I heard the neck starting to turn. With what little bravery I had left, I turned away, not daring to see that twisted face. "It's not me," Natalie yelled from the phone. The instant her voice reached my ear, I felt the glass shattering sound and a burning pain on my hand that lasted for a split second. I recoiled in pain, responding, "I know. I think it's gone now." I looked over to see and sure enough she wasn't there anymore. I breathed, "Don't hang up and drive over here. We need to see this thing through." On her drive over, she explained how when she woke up, she was seemingly stuffed under the bed, as if someone knocked her out and slid her under the bed. When she woke up and realized that I wasn't there, she knew something was up and called immediately. At this point I was freaking out a lot. So many questions rushed to mind. It talked. It acted just like my wife. How was it holding my hand? How in the world did it get out of the house? Most importantly, how do I tell it apart from my wife? That's when I remembered the stinging pain and looked at my hand. There was a very clear lucky burned into my hand. While I waited for my wife to drive over, I started thinking. The entity said breakfast's ready and sorry. And why in the world was it sipping orange juice? Is it evolving? Is it learning how to fool me? I wondered for a long time what all this meant until my wife finally arrived at 5 p.m. It was getting dark, and I wanted to go find a motel and come back tomorrow. But my wife insisted that we at least check to see if someone even lives in the abandoned house. Before she got out of the car, though, she took the cigarette lighter from her car and burned it on her hand. I got very upset when she did that, but she said it might help me tell them apart. At this point, any idea of rationalizing this fear sounded great. We went and knocked on the door as the doorbell seemed broken. "Did you hear that?" My wife looked at me terrified. "Hear what?" I wondered. "The scream. It sounds like someone is in pain." My instinct was to back out. I really wished I had. But before I could do anything, my wife was opening the door leading me in. I held her hand, while keeping one foot in the door. I was all too familiar with the classic door slams behind you in a creepy house to walk in completely. Inside, everything was dusty and full of webs. It was also unnervingly dark. As my eyes adjusted to the dark, I noticed that the house was completely trashed, with strange symbols scratched into the walls and on the broken furniture in a shade of red. Just then my wife started feeling lightheaded and began to fall. "I feel so dizzy," she mumbled. I immediately caught her as she passed out. Then, to my horror, as I looked up I saw her in the hallway. I could barely make out her figure, but her finger was pointed at me, with her head tilted at that unnatural angle. I did not need to stand there until I saw the rest of her creepy figure. I immediately turned around while dragging my wife with me. The door behind us slammed shut, but luckily my foot was in the door. I groaned in pain from the impact and lunged towards the barely open door and crashed outside with my wife. I looked back wishing she was gone, but she was still walking towards us, very slowly and deliberately. The next moments are kind of hazy as I was full of adrenaline. I somehow managed to throw my wife in the car and get in. As I looked in my rearview mirror, I saw her. Her mouth was now wide open and she screamed. As I hit the accelerator, I heard what sounded like the windows of the house smashing. I drove half an hour to a small motel to rent a room for the night. At this point, my wife is asleep, and I have not slept at all. I dare not look away from her. And what does the message on my hand mean? Is it toying with me, telling me I'm lucky my wife called to save me? Should I go into the house again with someone else? I typed up this update for you guys, and in a little bit she'll be up and we'll decide what our next move is. Any suggestions are welcome.
If you want more updates on what happens next, let me know in the comments.